Welcome to Sinister Truths, the channel where dark history, hidden stories, and unsettling realities come to light. Before we begin, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. Long before the Baron's name became synonymous with fear, his estate already stood apart from the world, both geographically and morally. Nestled beyond the last marked roads, surrounded by dense forests and marshland that swallowed sound and light alike, the Baron's domain was not merely land, it was a sealed universe, governed by his will alone. Travelers avoided it. Maps often mislabeled it or left it blank entirely. Those who lived nearby spoke of the estate only in whispers, as if the land itself listened. And for those forced to live and work within its boundaries, the Baroness property was not a home, nor even a prison in the traditional sense. It was something far worse, a place where power was absolute, and humanity was conditional. The Baron came from old money, generations of inherited wealth built on land grants, political favors, and human suffering. His ancestors had learned early that distance was power. The farther they placed themselves from oversight, the freer they were to rule as they pleased. By the time this Baron inherited the estate, it had already become a self-contained kingdom, operating under customs no court or church dared question. Officially, the Baron was a respected nobleman. Records described him as reserved, devout, even charitable. Taxes were paid, papers were filed. Inspectors rarely visited, and when they did, they were hosted lavishly, and shown only what the Baron wished them to see. A clean facade hid rot beneath. But beyond the grand gates, massive iron doors that groaned like wounded animals when opened, another reality existed. The enslaved population was large, drawn from different regions and backgrounds. Some had been born into bondage on the estate, never knowing a world beyond it. Others had been purchased, traded, or seized during times of unrest. Their languages, beliefs, and customs varied, but one thing unified them: they belonged to the Baron completely. Not just their labor, their time, their bodies, their silence. The estate was structured with deliberate precision. Fields stretched outward like spokes from a wheel, all leading back to the manor house at the center. From any point on the land, the Baron's residence was visible, its tall windows watching, its towers looming. It was a constant reminder that no matter where one stood, authority was always present. The manor itself was an architectural contradiction. Beautiful from a distance, monstrous up close. Stone walls thick enough to mute screams. Corridors designed not for comfort, but for confusion. Doors that led nowhere. Rooms without windows. Servants, enslaved servants, who knew better than to speak unless spoken to. And at the heart of it all was the Baron. He was not known for loud cruelty. He did not rage or strike impulsively. That was not his style. His power came from something colder, control rooted in ritual, repetition, and fear that seeped into the mind rather than the flesh. The Baron believed deeply in hierarchy, not as a social structure, but as a sacred law. In his view, some people were born to command, and others were born to obey. Questioning this order was not merely rebellion, it was heresy. And heresy in the Baron's world demanded correction. Unlike other estate owners who relied on overseers to enforce discipline, the Baron insisted on personal involvement. He wanted to be seen, to be felt, to be anticipated. His presence was meant to linger even when he was not physically there. That is why the door mattered. The Baron's study door, large, dark, and always closed, became the most feared object on the estate. It was located at the end of a long hallway lined with portraits of ancestors, each staring outward with painted eyes that seemed to follow anyone who passed. The hallway was silent by design. No rugs, no echoes. Every footstep was deliberate, isolated, exposed. To be summoned to that door was to feel the weight of judgment before a word had been spoken. But what made the Baron truly different, what transformed him from a cruel master into a symbol of something far more disturbing, was his obsession with obedience expressed through ceremony. He did not want submission given casually. He wanted it performed. Over time, the Baron became convinced that fear alone was insufficient. Fear could fade. Pain could be endured. But humiliation, carefully ritualized and endlessly repeated, reshaped the mind. It taught the enslaved not only to obey, but to internalize obedience as identity. And so slowly, deliberately, the ritual was born. At first it was small, a requirement to knock in a specific way, to lower the eyes, to wait in silence. Mistakes were corrected sharply but quietly. The enslaved were told these rules were for order and respect, but as weeks turned to months and months into years, the ritual evolved. Each new rule stripped away something human: dignity, spontaneity, choice. The Baron observed closely, adjusting details like a craftsman refining a blade. He paid attention to posture, breathing, hesitation. He noticed how fear manifested differently in each person, and he tailored the ritual to exploit that. Soon no one approached the Baron's door without rehearsing every movement in their mind. Children were taught the ritual before they could fully understand its meaning. Elders whispered corrections to the young, terrified that a mistake would not only bring punishment upon the individual, but collective suffering upon others. The ritual ceased to be an action. It became a condition of survival. What made it even more effective was its unpredictability. The Baron did not always summon people for wrongdoing. Sometimes there was no reason at all. A name would be called, a knock demanded, and the ritual would have to be performed perfectly, every time. This uncertainty poisoned daily life. People lived not according to natural rhythms of work and rest, but according to constant readiness. At any moment the door could demand them. The Baron understood something deeply unsettling. When people live in anticipation of judgment, they begin to police themselves. They enforce rules even when authority is absent. They pass fear down like inheritance, and that was exactly what he wanted. By the time the ritual reached its final form, it no longer required constant enforcement. The enslaved enforced it themselves, correcting posture, silencing whispers, warning newcomers. The Baron had succeeded in embedding himself into their minds. To outsiders, the estate appeared orderly, productive, quiet, but inside, every silence screamed. Every step toward the Baron's door felt like walking toward erasure. And this was only the beginning. The ritual did not arrive suddenly. It was not announced with a decree or carved into stone. Like many systems of cruelty that endure, it began quietly, almost politely, disguised as discipline, framed as order, justified as necessity. At first, the Baron spoke of standards. He told overseers that chaos bred defiance, and defiance bred rebellion. He claimed that structure protected everyone, that rules, if followed precisely, prevented misunderstanding and punishment alike. On the surface, the logic seemed harmless, even reasonable. After all, rules existed everywhere. But the Baron's genius lay in understanding how easily structure could be twisted into submission. The earliest version of the rule concerned approach. Any enslaved person summoned to the manor was required to stop exactly 3 steps from the study door. Not 2, not 4, 3. They were to wait in silence until acknowledged. No shifting weight, no clearing the throat, no movement of the hands. If the door remained closed, they were to wait. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. At first, mistakes were common. People misjudged the distance. Knees shook, feet adjusted instinctively. And when that happened, the punishment was swift, but measured. A sharp reprimand. Extra labor. Public correction. The Baron did not want rage. He wanted memory. Every punishment was designed not to destroy the body, but to imprint the lesson deeply enough that it would surface again the next time someone stood before that door. Soon people began rehearsing, counting steps in their heads, watching others from a distance, whispering instructions late at night, voices trembling with urgency. 3 steps, don't look up, don't speak. This was exactly what the Baron wanted. Within weeks, the rule became known estate-wide, not because it was written anywhere, but because fear carried it faster than ink ever could. Fear made it accurate. Fear made it precise. Then came the second layer. Knocking. The Baron introduced a specific pattern, slow, deliberate, evenly spaced. Not too loud, not too soft. A pause between each knock that had to be felt, not counted. He refused to explain the timing. He simply corrected those who failed. Some knocked too quickly, betraying nervousness. Others hesitated too long, revealing uncertainty. But were wrong. Only perfection was acceptable. The Baron observed each attempt carefully. He watched hands shake. He listened to breath between knocks. He claimed he could tell a person's loyalty by the sound their knuckles made against wood. And perhaps, in a twisted way, he believed it. What made the rule unbearable was not its difficulty, but its subjectivity. No one could ever be entirely certain they had done it correctly. Success depended not on obedience alone, but on guessing the Baron's mood. This uncertainty created something worse than fear, anticipation. People began to dread the summons days before it came. Sleep became restless. Muscles tightened unconsciously. Even those not summoned felt the tension ripple outward, like a sickness moving through the estate. The Baron noticed the change immediately. Productivity increased. Conversations grew quieter. Eye contact disappeared. The enslaved were no longer just obeying commands, they were preparing for judgment. That was when the Baron formalized the ritual. He announced, through overseers never directly, that the rules were now permanent, that deviation would be treated as defiance, and that defiance in his world was not merely disobedience, it was ingratitude. He framed the ritual as a privilege, an honor, a chance to demonstrate worthiness. Those who performed it correctly were spared punishment. Those who failed had only themselves to blame. This inversion of responsibility was crucial. Cruelty was no longer the Baron's choice, it was the enslaved person's failure. And once responsibility was shifted, resistance became psychologically dangerous. To object was to admit fault, to question was to confess guilt. The ritual grew more complex. Posture was added next. Shoulders back, but not rigid, head lowered, but not bowed too deeply. Eyes fixed on the floor at a precise distance from the feet. Hands at the sides, fingers relaxed but still. Any deviation, any sign of individuality was noted. The Baron believed that bodies revealed truth before mouths ever did. He watched for clenched fists, tight jaws, raised chins. Each was interpreted as a flaw in character. He kept mental records. Those records mattered. People soon learned that performing the ritual correctly once was not enough. Consistency was required. A single error could erase months of flawless obedience. Reputation, once damaged, was nearly impossible to repair. This created internal hierarchies among the enslaved. Those who mastered the ritual became examples. Overseers pointed them out. Be like them, they said. They know their place. But mastery came at a cost. Those who performed the ritual best were often the most broken. They moved like shadows, spoke only when necessary. Their faces were unreadable, not because they felt nothing, but because feeling had become dangerous. Children learned fastest. The Baron encouraged this. He ordered that young ones be brought to the manor to observe, not to participate, but to watch. To see what happened when rules were followed, and when they weren't. He believed early conditioning was essential. That fear learned young became instinct later. By adolescence, the ritual was second nature. The body responded before the mind could protest. Knees bent, eyes lowered, hands stilled. Obedience flowed automatically. The Baron had succeeded in rewriting reflexes. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the ritual was how it isolated people from one another. No two individuals were ever summoned together. The ritual was always solitary, standing alone before the door, separated from community, stripped of witnesses. Each person faced the Baron as an individual. There was no shared suffering in that moment, no collective strength, only isolation. This prevented unity. People could not compare experiences, could not confirm whether their treatment was fair or excessive. Each believed their fear was personal, their failure unique. Isolation bred self-blame, and self-blame is one of the strongest tools of control. The Baron reinforced this by occasionally rewarding perfect performance, extra rations, lighter work, small privileges given without explanation. These rewards created competition. People watched each other closely, not out of solidarity but suspicion. Any mistake by one could mean harsher rules for all. Any reward given to another sparked quiet resentment. The ritual had done more than enforce obedience, it had fractured community. And that fracture was intentional. The Baron understood that united people resist, but divided people survive individually at the expense of others. As years passed, the ritual became mythologized. People told stories about it, how it began, what it meant, what mistakes were unforgivable. Some details were exaggerated, others softened, but the fear remained accurate. New arrivals learned the rules before learning the land. Elders corrected posture with trembling hands. Mothers rehearsed knocks with their children at night. Fathers warned sons never to raise their eyes. The ritual no longer belonged to the Baron alone. It lived inside the people, and that was his greatest achievement. By formalizing the rule, the Baron had transformed fear into tradition, cruelty into culture, obedience into identity. The door no longer needed guarding. The ritual guarded itself. The summons never came loudly. There was no bell rung across the estate, no public announcement, no dramatic gesture. Instead, the Baron's command arrived in the most unsettling way possible, quietly, personally, and without explanation. A name would be spoken, sometimes by an overseer, sometimes by a servant who had learned never to ask questions, sometimes simply written on a slip of paper and handed over without a word. The message was always the same: you are expected at the manor. No reason was ever given. That absence of explanation was deliberate. The Baron understood that uncertainty was far more effective than accusation. If a person can what they were accused of, they could prepare a defense, or at least prepare emotionally. But when they knew nothing, the mind filled the silence with fear. As soon as the name was spoken, the estate shifted, work slowed, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Others avoided looking at the summoned person, not out of cruelty but superstition. It was believed that drawing attention might invite the same fate. Fear was contagious, and everyone knew it. For the summoned individual, the world narrowed instantly. Breathing became shallow. Hands felt heavy. Sounds dulled, as if distance had suddenly stretched between them and everything familiar. Some described it later, if they dared to speak of it at all, as the sensation of falling while standing still. The walk to the manor was never rushed. Hurrying was forbidden. Running was unthinkable. The Baron interpreted haste as panic, and panic in his mind was guilt. So the person walked. Every step was measured, every movement rehearsed. Fields that had been crossed countless times now felt unfamiliar, hostile. The path seemed longer than before, even though it had not changed. People counted their steps unconsciously, as if preparing for the door already. 3 steps, pause, 3 steps, breathe. The manor grew larger with each approach. Its walls appeared higher, its windows darker. Even in daylight, the building absorbed light rather than reflected it. Shadows clung to its corners like stains. At the gates, the world outside ended. The iron doors opened slowly, not as a welcome, but as a warning. Once inside, the summoned person entered a different reality, one governed entirely by silence. No greetings were exchanged, no instructions given. A guard or servant simply gestured forward. Inside the manor, sound behaved strangely. Footsteps echoed too loudly, then not at all. Voices seemed swallowed mid-air. The architecture disoriented intentionally. Corridors curved subtly. Ceilings lowered without warning. Doors appeared identical. People got lost easily, and getting lost was dangerous. But the path to the Baron's study was unmistakable. Everyone knew it. Everyone feared it. The hallway leading to the door was long and narrow, lined with portraits of former barons, ancestors whose wealth and authority had been preserved through generations of cruelty. Their painted eyes followed every movement, or at least felt as though they did. Some enslaved swore the portraits changed, that the expressions shifted depending on who walked beneath them. The hallway was designed to strip away comfort. No decorations softened it. No benches offered rest. The stone floor was cold even in summer, and polished just enough to reflect distorted images of those walking across it. Faces stretched, bodies bent, identities blurred. The closer one came to the door, the heavier the air felt. Breathing required effort. And then, at last, the door. Large, dark, imposing. Made of thick wood reinforced with iron bands. There were no marquee. NGS on it. No handles on the outside. No visible lock. It did not need them. The door did not protect the Baron from the enslaved. It protected the enslaved from the illusion that they had power. The summoned person stopped exactly 3 steps away, or tried to. This moment, this pause, was often the hardest part. The body wanted to react, to adjust balance, to shift weight, to swallow, to wipe sweat from the palms. Every instinct screamed for movement, and every instinct had to be ignored. Standing still became an act of endurance. The silence was unbearable. Sometimes the Baron waited intentionally. Minutes passed, then more. Legs trembled, muscles burned, thoughts spiraled. What did I do? Was it something I said? Was it something I didn't say? The mind searched desperately for answers, replaying recent days in obsessive loops. Every glance, every word, every breath suddenly felt suspicious. Some convinced themselves they were guilty of something terrible. Others convinced themselves they were innocent, which paradoxically frightened them even more. Innocence offered no protection here. Then came the knock. The ritual required the summoned person to knock only when commanded, but the command never came verbally. It was understood that the knock must occur once the silence reached its breaking point. Too soon, and it showed impatience. Too late, and it showed hesitation. The timing was subjective, cruelly so. Hands lifted slowly. Knuckles hovered inches from the door. The wood felt impossibly solid, like striking stone. The first knock echoed down the hallway, louder than expected. Pause. The second knock. Pause. The third. Each sound seemed to linger, as though the manor itself were listening. Then the wait. Sometimes the door opened immediately, sometimes it did not. When it didn't, the waiting returned, thicker now, heavier. Doubt crept in. Had the knock been wrong, too loud, too soft, too slow, too fast? The summoned person stood frozen, unable to correct a mistake they could not identify. When the door finally opened, it did so silently. Inside was darkness, not complete but controlled. Heavy curtains blocked the windows. Candles flickered low, casting uneven light. The Baron's desk sat at the far end, elevated slightly, ensuring anyone who entered had to look upward, if they dared. The summoned person did not step forward unless instructed. Most instructions were non-verbal: a raised finger, a pause, a slow tilt of the head. The Baron rarely spoke at first. He observed. He watched posture, breathing, eye movement. He noticed who trembled and who forced stillness. He noticed who fought fear, and who surrendered to it. This observation was part of the ritual. The walk to the door had already begun breaking the person down. By the time they stood before him, many were exhausted, not physically, but mentally, drained by anticipation, hollowed out by fear. The Baron believed that people revealed their true selves not under punishment, but under waiting. Waiting stripped away performance, and that was what he studied. For some, the ordeal ended quickly, a brief instruction, a dismissal. No explanation. These people left confused, shaken, and permanently altered by the experience. For others, the ordeal continued. But even those who were dismissed carried the walk with them long after it ended. The memory of that hallway, that door, that silence. The walk became legend. People compared it to walking toward judgment itself, toward erasure, toward a moment where identity dissolved and only obedience remained. Children dreamed of it before ever experiencing it. Adults woke from nightmares, sweating, heart racing, convinced they heard their name being called. The Baron had succeeded again. He had transformed a simple act, walking, into a weapon that did not wound the flesh, but reshaped the mind, and worst of all, the walk was unavoidable. Everyone would take it eventually. Crossing the threshold into the Baron's study was not the end of the ordeal. It was the beginning. The door closed silently behind the summoned person, sealing them inside a space where time behaved differently. Outside, life continued. Fields worked, meals prepared, voices murmured. Inside the study, none of that mattered. The room existed solely for the ritual, and the ritual existed solely to unmake the individual standing within it. The Baron designed the room carefully. It was not large, but it felt immense. The ceiling rose higher than necessary, forcing the eye upward even when one tried to look down. The walls were bare stone, stripped of warmth or comfort. No windows were visible at eye level. Light entered only from above, diffused and indirect, making it impossible to judge the time of day. The desk stood at the far end, elevated just enough to establish dominance. Behind it sat the Baron, always still, always composed. He dressed simply, avoiding extravagance. He understood that excess distracted from authority. Restraint amplified it. The ritual began before a word was spoken. The summoned person was expected to stop exactly at a mark on the floor, faint, nearly invisible, but known. Missing it by even a fraction invited correction. Feet had to be aligned, weight evenly distributed, shoulders drawn back. Head lowered to the precise angle that showed humility without suggesting mockery. Eyes were forbidden from meeting the Baron's, but they could not close either. Closing one's eyes was interpreted as withdrawal, refusal, concealment. The eyes had to remain open, unfocused, fixed on the floor. This position was called the stance. Maintaining it required constant effort. Muscles strained subtly, balance wavered. The body rebelled quietly, begging for relief. But relief was not permitted. The Baron allowed the silence to stretch. He believed silence revealed character, that people spoke most honestly when words were denied them. He waited for discomfort to surface, through trembling hands, shallow breathing, beads sweat tracing slow paths down temples. Only when the silence had done its work did the Baron speak. His voice was calm, almost gentle. State your purpose. This question was the first true test. The summoned person was not there by choice. They had no purpose of their own. But the ritual demanded an answer, and that answer had to follow a precise formula, learned through observation, rumor, and whispered instruction. To serve, my lord. Anything else was wrong. Too short and it showed insolence. Too long and it showed presumption. Any deviation, however minor, was noted. The Baron nodded, not in approval, but acknowledgement. Then came the gestures. The summoned person had to perform a sequence of movements, slow, deliberate, exact. A slight bow at the waist, timed with the Baron's breathing. Hands raised briefly, palms inward, then lowered. Knees bent just enough to signal submission, but never enough to kneel unless ordered. These gestures had no practical purpose. They were not rooted in tradition or religion. They existed solely to assert control. The Baron watched closely, correcting without emotion. Lower, slower, again. Each correction forced repetition. Each repetition deepened humiliation. The person was not allowed to ask what was wrong. They were expected to sense it, to intuit the Baron's expectations without guidance. This guessing was intentional. It kept the summoned off balance. It reminded them that perfection was defined not by rules, but by the Baron's will. And his will could shift at any moment. After the gestures came the words, a recitation, short, memorized, stripped of meaning through repetition. The words affirmed loyalty, gratitude, and acceptance of one's place. They were spoken softly, never above a measured tone. Voice mattered. Too strong, and it suggested pride. Too weak, and it suggested resentment. The Baron listened not for sincerity but for submission. Some voices cracked, others shook uncontrollably. A few remained steady, not because the speaker felt calm, but because fear had hardened into something colder. Those voices concerned the Baron most. He believed that visible fear was honest. Controlled fear suggested resistance. When the recitation ended, the summoned person had to wait again. This pause was unpredictable, sometimes brief, sometimes agonizingly long. The Baron might shuffle papers, write notes, stare without blinking. During this time, movement was forbidden. No shifting, no swallowing, no wiping sweat from the eyes. The body suffered quietly. Legs burned, backs ached, vision blurred. Some people fainted during this phase, collapsing where they stood. When that happened, they were not helped. They were removed later, unconscious or not, and their failure recorded. Fainting was considered weakness, and weakness, in the Baron's world, was dangerous. Those who remained standing faced the final element of the ritual, judgment. The Baron would speak, sometimes only a sentence, sometimes a single word, acceptable, or insufficient. The difference between the two could not be predicted. Acceptable did not mean safe, it meant survival for now. The summoned person would be dismissed without explanation, left to wonder what they had done right and how long it would last. Insufficient meant consequence, but even consequences followed ritual. The Baron never punished immediately. Immediate punishment satisfied anger, not control. Instead, he delayed. He allowed the person to return to their duties, carrying dread with them. The punishment would come later, publicly or privately, ensuring maximum impact. This delay amplified fear across the estate. No one knew when judgment would fall, or on whom. The ritual ended as it began, with silence. The summoned person was dismissed with a slight gesture, no farewell, no acknowledgement. They were expected to back away slowly, never turning their back on the Baron until reaching the door. Only once outside could they breathe freely again. Many wept in private afterward. Others went numb. Some remembered nothing at all, their minds protecting them by erasing details. But the body remembered, the stiffness, the trembling, the exhaustion. And the next time their name was called, the ritual became harder, not easier. Memory compounded fear, anticipation sharpened it. The Baron understood this perfectly. He believed the ritual refined people, that it separated the obedient from the defiant, that it revealed worth. But the truth was darker. The ritual erased individuality. People stopped expressing themselves entirely. Laughter disappeared. Spontaneity vanished. Creativity withered. Life narrowed to survival. The Baron did not need chains. He had posture. He had silence. He had repetition. And repetition was the most powerful tool of all. Because over time, The ritual no longer felt imposed, it felt inevitable. People began performing it in their minds constantly, rehearsing gestures, reciting words, correcting imaginary mistakes. Even far from the manor, the Baron's presence lingered. He had entered their thoughts. The ritual had succeeded. Failure, on the Baron's estate, was never immediate. That was the first lesson everyone learned. Punishment did not arrive in the moment of error, nor did it follow swiftly after judgment. Instead, it lingered in the air like a slow-moving storm, visible on the horizon, impossible to outrun, and devastating when it finally arrived. The Baron understood that delayed punishment was more powerful than instant pain. Pain could be endured, pain could be forgotten. But anticipation, uncertain, stretched, unresolved, reshaped the mind. When the Baron declared a performance insufficient, nothing happened at first. The summoned person was dismissed, allowed to return to their work, their family, their daily routines. To an outsider it might have appeared merciful, but everyone on the estate knew the truth. The judgment had been passed. Now came the waiting. The punished. Individual carried the knowledge alone. They were forbidden from speaking about the ritual, forbidden from explaining the Baron's words. Silence was mandatory. Even facial expressions were scrutinized. Any sign of distress invited suspicion and further scrutiny. This isolation intensified the suffering. At night, sleep refused to come. Each sound felt like a summons. Each footstep outside the quarters triggered panic. People replayed the ritual endlessly in their minds, searching for the mistake that had sealed their fate. Was it my posture, my voice? Did I hesitate too long? The mind clawed at itself for answers that would never arrive. The Baron sometimes waited days before acting, sometimes weeks. The longer the delay, the more the entire estate felt the tension. Whispers spread. People noticed who had been summoned and returned quietly. They noticed who flinched at sudden noises, who avoided eye contact, who worked with mechanical precision, desperate to appear flawless. Fear spread outward, infecting everyone. And then, without warning, the punishment came. Punishments were never improvised. They followed their own rituals, structured, symbolic, and designed to teach lessons beyond the individual. Rarely were they violent in the way people expected. The Baron believed excessive brutality dulled its own effect. Instead, he favored punishments that humiliated, isolated, and marked people socially. One common punishment was reassignment. The punished individual would be removed from familiar work and placed somewhere visible but degrading, cleaning spaces no one acknowledged, performing repetitive tasks under constant observation, or being assigned duties beneath their previous status. This demotion was deliberate. It signaled to others that the ritual governed not just survival, but position. One misstep could erase years of perceived reliability. Reputation, once lost, was nearly impossible to recover. Another punishment was enforced stillness. The punished person would be ordered to stand in a specific location for hours at a time, sometimes indoors, sometimes outdoors, without speaking or moving. Others were required to pass by without acknowledgement. This punishment was particularly cruel, to be seen but not recognized, to exist without interaction, to become an object in the landscape rather than a person. Children learned from this silently. They asked no questions. They absorbed the lesson instinctively. Some punishments involved restriction rather than addition, reduced food, limited rest, removal from communal spaces. These deprivations were subtle enough to appear accidental, but consistent enough to weaken both body and spirit over time. The Baron avoided anything that might provoke open sympathy. He wanted people afraid, not angry. Public punishments were reserved for specific moments. When the Baron felt the estate growing too comfortable, too relaxed, he chose an example. Someone whose failure could be framed as instructive rather than tragic. Someone whose absence would not disrupt productivity. The punishment was announced only moments before it occurred. People were gathered, not forcibly, but through implication. Attendance was understood. Absence would be noticed. The punished individual was brought forward, often confused, sometimes numb. They were not allowed to speak. Explanation was forbidden. The Baron believed explanation diluted authority. Instead, the overseer would announce the charge in simple terms: failure to perform the ritual correctly. Nothing more, no defense, no context, no appeal. The punishment itself varied, but its purpose was consistent: to demonstrate the cost of imperfection. Sometimes it was physical labor beyond endurance, sometimes isolation, sometimes public correction. forcing the individual to perform the ritual again and again until exhaustion broke their composure. What mattered was not suffering. What mattered was observation. The Baron watched the crowd closely during these moments. He noted who looked away, who clenched their fists, who stood too still. Those observations shaped future summons. The punished individual was rarely the true target, the audience was. Afterwards, silence followed. No one spoke of what they had seen. Not because they were ordered not to, but because words felt dangerous, as if naming the event might summon it again. People internalized the lessons differently. Some became obsessively precise. They corrected others harshly, hoping proximity to obedience would protect them. Others withdrew entirely, doing only what was necessary to avoid attention. Friendships fractured, trust eroded. The Baron had anticipated this. He believed fear functioned best when it divided, when people focused inward on survival rather than outward on solidarity. Punishment was a wedge, driven carefully between individuals, splitting community into isolated units. Perhaps the most devastating punishment of all was uncertainty. Some failures were never punished. People waited. Days passed. Weeks. Months. Nothing happened. This was not mercy. It was conditioning. Those spared punishment lived in constant vigilance, unsure whether they had been forgiven or simply forgotten. They worked harder than anyone else, watched themselves constantly, corrected imagined mistakes. The Baron knew that fear without release exhausted people faster than pain. Over time, punishment no longer needed to occur frequently. The memory of it was enough. Stories circulated, some true, some exaggerated, some invented entirely, but all reinforcing the same belief: the ritual was absolute. Failure was ruin, and ruin could arrive at any time. People began to blame themselves preemptively. Even before being summoned, they assumed guilt. They apologized for imagined wrongs. They lowered their eyes automatically. They performed the ritual in private spaces, rehearsing as if their lives depended on it. In a sense, they did. The Baron had achieved something terrifyingly epic. He had created a system where punishment was no longer required to enforce obedience. The possibility of punishment was sufficient. Fear had become self-sustaining, and yet, despite all of this, something unexpected began to stir beneath the surface. Tiny, fragile, almost invisible. A question, not spoken aloud, not even fully formed, but present. What if the ritual only worked because everyone believed in it? That question would take years to grow, and many would never allow themselves to think it. But it existed, quietly, dangerously. The Baron eventually realized something that separated him from lesser masters of cruelty. Fear alone was unstable. Fear could ignite rebellion if it became too sharp, too visible, too unjust. Pain could harden people. Even punishment, when repeated too openly, could teach endurance instead of obedience. But humiliation, quiet, internalized, endlessly repeated, did something far more effective. It rewrote identity. The ritual was never truly about discipline. It was about transformation. It was designed not to punish mistakes, but to make people believe they themselves were the mistake. Humiliation worked slowly. It did not arrive with screams or force. It arrived through posture, through silence, through the endless demand to perform submission perfectly, knowing perfection was impossible. Every time someone stood before the Baron and failed, even slightly, they absorbed a message deeper than any blow could deliver. You are inadequate, not because of what you did, but because of who you are. Over time, this message took root. People stopped thinking of themselves as individuals with strengths, histories, and value. They began to think of themselves as variables, acceptable or insufficient, correct or flawed, worthy of survival or deserving of consequence. The Baron encouraged this mindset subtly. He never called the enslaved by name during the ritual. Names implied identity. Identity implied humanity. Instead, he referred to them as you, or not at all. Silence replaced recognition. To be seen without being acknowledged was one of the most powerful humiliations on the estate. It taught people that existence did not guarantee significance, that they could be present and still invisible, and invisibility was safer. People learned quickly that standing out, through confidence, skill, or even kindness, invited attention. Attention led to summons. Summons led to the door. So they learned to shrink. Voices softened, movements slowed, expressions flattened, People trained themselves to occupy as little space as possible, to become forgettable. This self-erasure was not ordered, it was chosen, and that made it permanent. The ritual reinforced this daily. Even when someone was not summoned, they felt its presence. They corrected their posture unconsciously, lowered their eyes automatically, measured their tone when speaking to anyone in authority. The Baron no longer needed to watch constantly. People watched themselves. Humiliation also reshaped relationships. The ritual demanded solitude. Failure was personal, punishment was individualized. This isolation ensured that shame could not be shared. Shared suffering creates bonds, private shame dissolves them. People stopped confiding in one another. They feared that admitting weakness might mark them as dangerous, or worse, tempt others to distance themselves for safety. Compassion became risky. If someone showed empathy toward a punished individual, it could be interpreted as sympathy for failure. Sympathy suggested disagreement. Disagreement suggested defiance, so people learned to look away, not because they were cruel, but because survival required distance. The Baron observed this fragmentation with satisfaction. He had always believed that unity was the enemy of control. The ritual had shattered it without force. Humiliation also distorted memory. Those summoned repeatedly began to question their own perceptions. The Baron's corrections were vague, inconsistent, sometimes contradictory. One day a posture was acceptable. Another day, it was insufficient. This inconsistency was intentional. It taught people that their judgment could not be trusted, that only the Baron's interpretation mattered. Over time, people stopped relying on their own understanding of right and wrong. They deferred instinctively. This was psychological dependence. The Baron became not just an authority, but the measure of reality itself. People began asking permission for things they had once done freely. Speaking less, moving less, thinking less. Thought itself became dangerous, because thought led to questions, and questions led to doubt. Humiliation reached its deepest level when people began to feel gratitude for survival. Those who were declared acceptable after the ritual felt relief so intense it bordered on thankfulness, not because the experience was humane, but because it could have been worse. This gratitude confused the mind. It blurred the line between mercy and cruelty, between relief and loyalty. People began to associate safety with obedience not just behaviorally, but emotionally. They felt calmer when following rules, even absurd ones, anxious when acting freely. Freedom began to feel dangerous. The Baron had succeeded in redefining normalcy. Humiliation also affected how people viewed the Baron himself. He was rarely overtly cruel. He did not shout. He did not strike impulsively. Compared to stories of harsher masters elsewhere, he seemed restrained. This comparison worked in his favor. People told themselves he was fair, that the ritual had rules, that if they just learned them perfectly, they could live peacefully. This illusion was crucial. It made people complicit in their own control. They blamed themselves for failure rather than questioning the system that guaranteed it. The Baron never corrected this belief. He nurtured it. He occasionally allowed someone to rise, granting slightly better work, small privileges, symbol. Recognition. These individuals became living proof that obedience worked. They also became cautionary figures. Because their status was fragile, everyone knew one mistake could destroy them. This constant precarity kept ambition low and compliance high. Even humor disappeared under humiliation. Laughter became rare, and when it happened it was subdued, cautious. People laughed quietly, checking their surroundings instinctively. Joy felt like exposure. Celebrations faded. Stories shortened. Songs softened until they were barely audible. The estate grew quiet, not because people were content, but because silence felt safe. The Baron's greatest success was not the ritual itself. It was what came after. The ritual planted humiliation. Humiliation grew into self-regulation. Self-regulation evolved into belief. People believed they deserved their position. Belief is the strongest chain of all. And yet, despite this total control, humiliation had a flaw. It relied on internalization. And what is internalized can sometimes be questioned. Very rarely, in moments of exhaustion or private reflection, a thought surfaced. Why does standing this way matter? Why does silence mean obedience? Why does one person decide worth? These thoughts were dangerous. Most people crushed them immediately, terrified of their own minds. But a few did not. A few held on to the questions quietly, carefully, as if protecting a fragile ember from wind. They did not speak, they did not resist openly, they simply observed. And observation, over time, led to understanding. Understanding led to something else. Resistance did not arrive with raised voices or broken chains. It arrived with pauses, with glances held a second too long, with hands that hesitated, not in fear but in thought. It arrived quietly, disguised as fatigue, hidden beneath obedience so practiced it appeared sincere. That was the only way it could survive. On the Baron's estate, open rebellion was unthinkable. Everyone understood the cost. Punishment was not merely personal, it was contagious. One act of defiance could ripple outward, tightening control on everyone else. So resistance adapted. It learned to speak in whispers. The first cracks appeared in routine, small things, almost invisible. Someone would stop exactly 3 steps from the door, but place their foot just slightly differently than instructed. Someone would lower their head to the correct angle, but allow their eyes to focus rather than blur. Someone would perform the gestures flawlessly, but breathe steadily instead of shallowly. None of these acts violated the ritual, but they changed its meaning. The Baron had designed the ritual to induce fear, to force the body into submission before the mind could follow. But those who began to resist learned something crucial. Fear required belief, and belief could be weakened. These individuals did not refuse the ritual. That would have been suicide. Instead, they performed it without surrender. They memorized every rule, every gesture, every pause, and then executed them with precision so exact it denied the Baron what he truly wanted. Fear. At first, the Baron did not notice. Those summoned most often were already deeply conditioned. Their performances were predictable. But over time, patterns emerged. A few individuals showed no visible deterioration, no trembling, no exhaustion. They performed perfectly, consistently, too consistently. This unsettled the Baron. He believed fear revealed truth. Calm suggested resistance, but he could not punish calm without exposing the arbitrary nature of his system. So he watched, and those being watched learned to watch back. Information became resistance's most powerful tool. People began sharing knowledge quietly, not openly, not directly, but through observation and suggestion. A slight nod meant, hold your breath longer. A whispered phrase meant, pause before the third knock. A child repeating a rhyme learned not for play but for timing. Elders taught the ritual differently, not as obedience but as performance. They reframed it in secret. This is not who you are. This is what you do to survive. That distinction mattered. It preserved identity. Resistance also emerged through care. Care was dangerous, but it endured. People checked on one another without words, shared food discreetly, took over tasks for someone still recovering from a summons. They did not console openly, but they stayed close. Presence itself became defiance. The Baron's system relied on isolation, on making people believe they were alone in their fear. But small acts of solidarity disrupted that illusion. Even silence could be shared. The greatest act of resistance, however, was memory. The Baron wanted the ritual to erase the past, to make people forget who they had been before obedience. But stories survived, in fragments, in gestures, in lullabies sung so softly they barely reached the ear. Stories of life before the estate, of traditions, of names. Names mattered. Using someone's name, quietly, privately, was an act of reclamation. It reminded people they existed beyond their assigned roles. Children learned 2 identities, one for the Baron, one for themselves. This duality was dangerous, but powerful. The Baron sensed something shifting, though he could not name it. Productivity remained high. The ritual was performed flawlessly. Punishments decreased. On paper, control had never been stronger. But control was hollowing out. The ritual had become routine, not terror. And routine, stripped of fear, lost its potency. The Baron responded by tightening rules, adding complexity, introducing new corrections. But complexity backfired. The more intricate the ritual became, the more it exposed itself as artificial, arbitrary, constructed. People began to see it not as law, but as theater, and theater could be endured, mocked, internally, silently. A few began to test limits carefully. They altered timing by fractions of seconds, adjusted posture, minutely, watched for reaction. Sometimes nothing happened. The absence of punishment was electrifying. It confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The Baron's power was not absolute. It depended on compliance, and compliance depended on belief. One incident changed everything. A young worker, summoned unexpectedly, performed the ritual flawlessly. Too flawlessly, calm, steady, controlled. The Baron watched closely, unsettled. When the ritual ended, the Baron said nothing. No judgment, no dismissal, just silence. Minutes passed. The young worker did not move, neither did the Baron. For the first time in years, the ritual stalled. Finally, the Baron spoke. "Leave." That was all. No punishment followed, no reward. The young worker returned unchanged, but the story spread, quietly, carefully, not exaggerated, not dramatized, just shared. The ritual didn't work, people whispered. They weren't afraid. This moment did not ignite rebellion, but it did something more important. It proved possibility. The Baron sensed the shift too late. His punishments grew harsher but less effective. Fear no longer spread as it once had. People endured it with a kind of detached awareness. Humiliation stopped reshaping identity. It began to slide off. The Baron had built a system that depended on internal collapse. But once people learned to protect their inner selves, to separate performance from belief, the system began to fail. Resistance remained quiet, but it was everywhere, in steady breathing, in shared glances, in remembered names. And once people realized they were not alone in their thoughts, the Baron's greatest weapon, isolation, was gone. Power built on fear always believes it is eternal. That was the Baron's final mistake. For years, decades perhaps, the ritual had functioned as flawlessly as any system of control ever could. It required no chains, no constant violence, no visible force. It lived inside the people. It shaped posture, thought, identity. It turned obedience into instinct. But systems like this do not collapse all at once. They decay, slowly, quietly, almost politely. By the time the Baron sensed that something was wrong, the ritual was already hollow. Outwardly, nothing had changed. The summons continued. The walk to the door remained silent and precise. The gestures were executed perfectly, the words spoken without error. But the fear was gone, and without fear the ritual was nothing more than a sequence of empty movements. The Baron noticed it first in the eyes. They were still lowered, still obedient in appearance, but no longer vacant, no longer unfocused. They held something he had not seen in years: distance. The Baron responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control. He added new layers to the ritual, new pauses, new gestures, new expectations that contradicted the old ones. He punished more frequently, though still selectively. He isolated individuals more aggressively, hoping to reignite the dread that once rippled through the estate. But fear does not return on command. The punishments landed differently now. People endured them with a strange calm, not defiance, not bravery, but clarity. They no longer searched themselves endlessly for fault. They no longer believed punishment revealed truth. They saw it for what it was: performance. The Baron, who had once controlled perception itself, was now being perceived. And that terrified him. His study became quieter, not with the heavy silence of authority, but with the thin silence of uncertainty. He lingered longer during rituals, watching for reactions that no longer came. He corrected minor details obsessively, grasping for the old power that once flowed effortlessly. But obsession is not authority. It is exposure. Others on the estate noticed his change. The Baron walked the grounds more often, inspecting work personally. He questioned overseers sharply. He demanded reports. He watched conversations from a distance. The watchers were now being watched. This reversal mattered. Fear works best when it feels invisible, omnipresent, unquestionable. Once fear reveals its source as fragile, it loses its grip. Then came the moment that ended everything. It was not dramatic. There was no uprising, no shouting, no storming of the manor, just a summons. An elder, someone who had performed the ritual more times than most, was called to the door. The estate held its breath, not in terror, but anticipation. The elder walked the path calmly, stopped 3 steps from the door, knocked perfectly, entered. Inside, the ritual unfolded exactly as prescribed. Every gesture precise, every word spoken correctly. The performance was flawless. When it ended, the Baron spoke. Again. This was unusual, rare, a test. The elder repeated the ritual, still flawless. The Baron's voice tightened. Again, a 3rd time. The room stretched with tension, not fear, but confrontation. When the ritual ended for the 3rd time, the Baron waited for something, Hesitation, trembling, collapse. None came. The elders stood quietly, present, whole. For the first time in years, the Baron felt exposed. He had no correction left to give, no flaw to exploit. The ritual, his greatest weapon, had failed him. "Leave," he said finally. The elder turned and walked out without backing away. It was a small act, but it shattered everything. Word spread, not as rumor, but certainty. The ritual could be broken, not through rebellion, but through refusal to internalize it. From that day forward, obedience continued. But belief did not. People performed the ritual because it was required, not because it defined them. The Baron punished, but the punishments no longer reshaped identity. Control slipped. Overseers hesitated. Guards questioned quietly. Productivity faltered, not from resistance, but from indifference. The Baron's authority had depended on psychological dominance. Without it, he was just a man in a room. Time finished what fear no longer could. Records grow unclear, as they often do when power collapses quietly. Some say the Baron fell ill. Others say he withdrew entirely, refusing to summon anyone to the door. A few claim inspectors finally arrived and found an estate strangely compliant, eerily calm, its master isolated and diminished. What is certain is this: the ritual ended. The door was closed for the last time, not with a bang, but with irrelevance. Afterward, people struggled with freedom. This is the part history rarely emphasizes. Freedom does not arrive cleanly after control. It arrives tangled, confusing, heavy with memory. People still lowered their eyes instinctively, still measured their steps, still felt fear in silence. The ritual lived on in their bodies. Healing took time. Some never fully shed it. But something had changed permanently. People spoke their names aloud again. Children were taught stories without whispering. Laughter returned. Hesitant, at first, then fuller. The Baron's study was abandoned. The door remained, but it lost its meaning. Eventually it was just wood and iron again, no longer an altar, no longer a threat. The legacy of the ritual, however, did not disappear. It survived as warning. Because the Baron's system was not unique, it was simply refined. Throughout history, and even today, power has often relied not on chains, but on humiliation, on rituals that force people to perform submission until they believe it reflects truth. The lesson of the Baron's door is not just about one estate. It is about how control works, how fear becomes habit, how obedience becomes identity, and how the most dangerous prisons are the ones people carry inside themselves. But it is also about something else: resilience, the quiet kind, the kind that survives by remembering who you are beneath performance, the kind that waits patiently until fear exhausts itself. The Baron believed he owned bodies. For a long time he owned minds too. But minds once awakened do not stay owned, and rituals built on fear always end the same way, not with rebellion, but with disbelief. And once belief is gone, power collapses, silently, completely, and forever.